Isabella Grant had built her life with precision. As the CEO of one of the fastest-growing luxury architecture firms in the world, she was admired for her sharp mind, uncompromising vision, and seemingly unshakable composure. Her days were filled with high-stakes meetings, exclusive client dinners, and keynote speeches that commanded rooms of thousands. Yet despite the demands of her career, Isabella had always prided herself on maintaining a balance. Or so she thought. She was the woman who had it all: a sprawling penthouse, a devoted husband, Ethan, and a hand-picked circle of friends and colleagues she trusted implicitly. Later, the illusion of perfection began to flicker at an anniversary party meant to celebrate a decade of marriage to Ethan. The event was held at an exclusive rooftop venue overlooking the city skyline, a location Ethan had chosen as a romantic nod to their first date. Isabella's colleagues mingled seamlessly with their closest friends and family, the champagne flowing as laughter punctuated the warm evening air. But beneath the glittering surface, Isabella couldn't shake a growing unease. It started with something small, a momentary glance exchanged between Ethan and her business partner, Lucas Rivera, that lingered a second too long. She couldn't place why it felt off, but something about it gnawed at her, like a thread waiting to unravel. She dismissed it at first, chalking it up to the stress of the event. Yet the evening seemed to offer more subtle clues. Ethan was unusually attentive, his compliments too polished, too rehearsed. Lucas, on the other hand, seemed preoccupied, avoiding eye contact with Isabella while engaging others with his usual charm. The dissonance between their behaviors tugged at her subconscious, creating an undercurrent of doubt. As the night wore on, Isabella found herself in the company of Elena, a close friend and fellow architect who shared her love of historical preservation. Elena, with her quick wit and infectious enthusiasm, was one of the few people Isabella trusted completely. But even Elena seemed slightly guarded tonight, her conversation deflecting when Isabella brought up plans for an upcoming project. A project Lucas was supposed to spearhead. "Lucas hasn't said much about it to me lately," Elena said, swirling her drink absently. "I guess he's been busy?" Lucas had always been meticulous about keeping her informed, especially on high-profile projects. "With what?" Elena hesitated, her smile faltering. "Oh, you know how he is. Always juggling a million things. You should ask him." She quickly changed the subject, leaving Isabella with more questions than answers. After a while, Elena turned to grab the pistol and prepared to fire the warning. By the time the party wound down, Isabella's mind was racing. The city lights glittered like jewels beneath the rooftop, but they offered no clarity. Ethan had slipped away to bid farewell to a few guests, and Lucas had disappeared without so much as a goodbye. Alone, Isabella leaned against the railing, her gaze fixed on the skyline, the weight of unease settling heavily on her chest. It was then that her phone buzzed with a notification. A photo sent from an anonymous number. Her heart dropped as she opened it. The image showed Ethan and Lucas together, not at the party, but in a dimly lit bar, their heads bent close in what appeared to be an intense discussion. The time take was from 2 nights ago, when Ethan had told her he was working late at the office. Her mind raced with possibilities. Was it business? A harmless meeting? Or was this the beginning of something darker? Isabella's analytical mind, the very tool that had built her empire, sprang into action. She needed facts, not assumptions. Isabella glanced back at the crowd, her expression carefully neutral. Whatever this was, she wouldn't let it blindside her. She was a master at strategy, and if there was one thing she understood, it was that timing was everything. For now, she would wait, observe, and piece together the puzzle, but deep down she knew her perfect life had just shifted on its axis, and there would be no turning back. End of part 1. 2 nights after the anniversary party, Isabella found herself alone in her penthouse office. She had dismissed Ethan's attempts at casual conversation earlier, claiming she needed to focus on preparing for a presentation. He had seemed unusually content with her withdrawal, leaving for the gym with a cheery wave. Now, she sat in the glow of her laptop screen, scrolling through emails and files with an intensity that betrayed her mounting unease. The photo from the anonymous sender had thrown her off balance, but it wasn't enough to act on. Not yet. She needed more than a cryptic image to confront Ethan or Lucas, and certainly more than her own suspicions. If there was one thing Isabella knew, it was that missteps in her world could cost dearly, both in her personal life and her career. Her fingers danced over the keyboard as she pulled up the company's internal server. The bar in the photo wasn't a place Ethan or Lucas would normally frequent. It was too far removed from their usual haunts. But the timestamp suggested it wasn't a casual encounter. Lucas had always been meticulous about billing client meetings, and if the meeting had been legitimate, it would show up somewhere. It didn't. Lucas's expense reports were flawless as always, but there was no mention of a meeting at the bar. In fact, his recent reports showed a pattern that Isabella hadn't noticed before. Small, consistent withdrawals labeled as miscellaneous, all uncharacteristic for someone as exacting as Lucas. She jotted the dates down, cross-referencing them with Ethan's calendar. Her heart sank as she noticed overlaps. Times when Ethan had claimed late meetings or sudden plans that had kept him out. Isabella leaned back in her chair, staring at the neatly arranged records on her screen. The pieces weren't fitting together yet, but they were beginning to take shape. It wasn't just the lies that unnerved her, it was the coordination behind them. Whatever Ethan and Lucas were involved in, they had gone to great lengths to cover their tracks. She closed her laptop and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows of her penthouse. The city stretched out before her, glittering and alive, but it felt distant, like a stage set for a play she was no longer directing. A memory surfaced, unbidden, of a time when Ethan had surprised her with flowers after she landed her first major client. He had been so earnest, so proud of her success, that Ethan felt like a stranger now, replaced by someone whose affections felt scripted, whose actions rang hollow. The next morning, Isabella arrived at the office early, determined to observe Lucas without tipping her hand. He arrived shortly after her, his usual charming self, carrying coffee and pastries for the team. His easy laughter filled the space, and for a moment, Isabella questioned her suspicions. Could she be imagining all of this? But as the morning wore on, her doubts resurfaced. Lucas avoided her gaze during their weekly meeting, his responses to her questions unusually vague. When she mentioned the upcoming project, a flagship design for a tech mogul, he stumbled over his words, claiming he was still finalizing some details. It was a weak excuse, and Isabella knew it. Lucas never procrastinated, not on something this important. After the meeting, Elena cornered Elena, who had been conspicuously quiet during the discussion. "Elena," she said, her voice calm but firm. "What's going on with Lucas? He's been distracted lately." Elena hesitated, her expression flickering with something between guilt and discomfort. "I don't know, Bella. He's just been acting different. Maybe it's personal? I mean, you know how stressful things can get around here." Isabella didn't press further, but the unease in Elena's voice told her everything she needed to know. Whatever Lucas was hiding, Elena was aware of it. Or at least part of it. That evening, Isabella decided to follow Ethan. It was a bold move, one that made her stomach churn with anxiety, but she needed answers. He had mentioned a dinner with a prospective client, casually brushing off her offer to join him with a smile and a kiss on the cheek. "It's nothing major," he'd said. "Just building rapport." Dressed inconspicuously in a simple coat and scarf, Isabella tailed Ethan's car from a discreet distance. He didn't head to the restaurant he'd mentioned, but instead drove across town to a private club she recognized as a haunt for the city's elite. She parked a block away and followed him on foot, keeping her distance as he entered the building. The club's lobby was dimly lit, with plush furniture and soft jazz playing in the background. Isabella lingered near the entrance, pretending to check her phone while scanning the room. It didn't take long to spot Ethan. He was seated in a secluded corner booth, not with a client, but with Lucas. Her chest tightened as she watched them. Their body language was telling. Ethan leaned in, speaking animatedly, while Lucas nodded, his expression serious. A waitress brought them drinks, and Ethan handed her a credit card without hesitation. Isabella's breath caught as she realized it wasn't his personal card, but a corporate one. Her company's card. She didn't stay to hear their conversation. The sight of them together was enough to confirm her worst fears. This wasn't a casual meeting. It wasn't even about business. It was a betrayal, and it went deeper than she'd imagined. Back in her car, Isabella gripped the steering wheel, her mind racing. Ethan and Lucas weren't just conspiring against her personally. They were using her company as a tool for their schemes. The implications were staggering. If this came to light, it could ruin her reputation, her firm, and everything she had worked for. But Isabella wasn't the type to crumble under pressure. She had built her empire from nothing, overcoming obstacles that would have broken lesser people. This betrayal wouldn't be the end of her. It would be her fuel. She spent the rest of the night devising a plan. If Ethan and Lucas thought they could outmaneuver her, they were gravely mistaken. She would uncover every detail of their scheme, every lie they had told, and she would use it against them. But first, she needed to confirm the full extent of their betrayal. Isabella hired a private investigator the next morning, a discreet professional known for his efficiency and discretion. She handed him the photo, along with the dates and locations she had pieced together. "I need everything," she told him. "Who they've met, what they've discussed, and where the money is going." The investigator nodded, his expression unreadable. As the days passed, Isabella played her role flawlessly. To Ethan, she was the devoted wife, busy with her own commitments. To Lucas, she was the focused CEO, confident in his abilities. She smiled, she listened, she waited. The notifications stopped ringing. Then there was a text. "And you're late. I thought you'd be here already." But beneath the surface, she was a storm waiting to break. The town council had always kept a strict eye on her, even when the rest of the town had left it to wander away. The private investigator returned within a week, his report meticulously detailed. Isabella sat in her office as he laid out the evidence, her hands folded on the mahogany desk, her expression an unreadable mask. Beneath her calm facade, her mind churned, processing each piece of information with the precision of an architect surveying blueprints for a crumbling structure. The investigator's findings were damning. Ethan and Lucas had been meeting in secret for months, often at discreet locations far from their usual circles. Financial records revealed that Lucas had diverted company funds into a shell account under an alias, masking fraudulent transfers as project expenses. Ethan had played his part by signing off on fake invoices, using his position as her spouse to access sensitive information about the company's operations. Together, they had funneled significant sums, enough to destabilize one of her firm's most ambitious projects. But the betrayal didn't end there. The investigator uncovered a web of connections between Ethan and one of Isabella's largest competitors, a rival architecture firm that had recently won a lucrative contract Isabella had been courting for months. Ethan had brokered the deal, using insider information about her bid to undercut her offer. The revelation hit Isabella like a gut punch. Her husband had not only stolen from her, but had also sabotaged her professionally, feeding her competitor the tools to humiliate her on a public stage. Still, the most devastating detail was a series of photos the investigator provided, taken just days earlier. They showed Ethan and Lucas in a private villa, joined by a woman Isabella recognized instantly, Elena. The friend she had trusted implicitly, the colleague who had stood by her side through countless challenges, was part of the conspiracy. The images were candid, showing the trio laughing over glasses of wine, poring over documents Isabella couldn't make out but could easily guess their contents. It was all there, proof that the people closest to her had formed a triumvirate of deceit, conspiring to rob her of everything she had worked for. Isabella thanked the investigator and sent him on his way, assuring him his work had been invaluable. Once the door to her office closed, she sat in silence, staring at the neatly organized evidence spread before her. She felt a swirl of emotions: rage, betrayal, heartbreak. But above all, a steely resolve. This wasn't just a personal affront, it was an attack on everything she had built. And Isabella Grant didn't crumble, she rebuilt, stronger than before. The first step in her response was to consolidate power. Isabella knew she couldn't confront them immediately. They would deny everything, spin lies, and try to manipulate her. Instead, she needed to create a strategy as flawless as the buildings her firm designed. Strong, impenetrable, and with no room for error. She began by securing her company's finances. Using the evidence the investigator had uncovered, she quietly flagged the fraudulent accounts and froze all suspicious transactions. Then, she initiated an internal audit, framing it as a routine measure to ensure compliance with new regulations. Lucas, unaware that the walls were closing in, even praised her for her diligence. Next, she strengthened her alliances. Isabella reached out to key clients and stakeholders, reinforcing their loyalty with personal touches, exclusive project previews, updates on upcoming ventures, and one-on-one dinners that showcased her vision for the company's future. She knew her reputation was her strongest asset, and she wasn't about to let whispers of scandal tarnish it. With the professional groundwork laid, Isabella turned her attention to the personal betrayal. She started with Elena. Inviting Elena to her penthouse for a casual dinner was almost too easy. Elena arrived with a bottle of wine and her usual effervescent smile, oblivious to the storm brewing beneath Isabella's composed exterior. They chatted over appetizers, reminiscing about old projects and mutual acquaintances. But as the evening progressed, Isabella steered the conversation toward Lucas. "Elena," Isabella began, swirling her glass of wine as she fixed her friend with an intense gaze, "do you ever get the feeling Lucas is hiding something?" The question caught Elena off guard. Her smile faltered for a split second before she recovered. "What do you mean?" Lately I've noticed some inconsistencies in his work," Isabella said, her tone casual but probing. "Missing files, vague answers about important projects. It's unlike him, don't you think?" Elena hesitated, her eyes darting to her glass. "Lucas has been under a lot of pressure. Maybe he's just distracted." "Distracted?" Isabella's voice sharpened, and for a brief moment she let a hint of her anger slip through. "Or complicit?" Elena froze, her face paling. I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't you?" Isabella leaned forward, her gaze unrelenting. "Because I have a private investigator's report that says otherwise." The color drained from Elena's face. She opened her mouth to protest, but found no words. Isabella pulled out the photos, laying them on the table one by one. "This is you," she said, her voice cold. "With Ethan, with Lucas, at the villa, laughing over my stolen money, my stolen projects. Did you really think I wouldn't find out?" Elena's hands trembled as she reached for the photos, her expression a mix of shame and fear. "Isabella, it's not what it looks like." "So I'm afraid to be correct," Elena answered, nodding. Isabella smiled faintly. "Then explain it," Isabella demanded, her voice rising. "Explain how my best friend became part of a scheme to destroy me?" Elena broke down, her facade crumbling. She confessed in halting sentences, revealing how Lucas had approached her first, promising lucrative opportunities if she helped him manipulate project details. Ethan's involvement had come later, using his proximity to Isabella to gather sensitive information. Elena claimed she had been dragged in, that she had wanted to back out but felt trapped. Isabella listened without interrupting, her expression unreadable. When Elena finished, her face streaked with tears, Isabella spoke with chilling finality. "You betrayed me, and there's no coming back from that." She didn't offer forgiveness, nor did she allow Elena the chance to plead further. By the time the elevator doors closed behind Elena, Isabella had already decided her fate. Dealing with Ethan and Lucas required a different approach. They were more calculated, more dangerous. Isabella knew she couldn't simply confront them. She needed to dismantle their power, piece by piece. She began by leaking carefully curated information to the media. A trusted journalist received an anonymous tip about fraudulent activities at her rival architecture firm, activities linked to insider information and shady dealings. Within days, the firm was under investigation, its reputation in tatters. Ethan's name hadn't surfaced yet, but Isabella knew it was only a matter of time. Simultaneously, she arranged for Lucas to be implicated in the internal audit. When irregularities were uncovered, he was called into a meeting with the board, where Isabella presented the evidence with icy professionalism. Lucas denied everything, but the documents spoke for themselves. He was escorted from the building, his protests falling on deaf ears. Ethan was the final piece. Isabella waited until the fallout from Lucas and the rival firm had reached its peak. Then, armed with her investigators' findings and the weight of her professional triumph, she confronted him in their home. "Do you know what the difference is between us, Ethan?" she asked, her voice calm despite the fury in her eyes. "You think in shortcuts. I build foundations. And I've just destroyed yours." Ethan, cornered and exposed, tried to justify his actions, blaming Lucas, blaming their marriage, even blaming Isabella herself. But she didn't listen. She had already set her plan in motion. By the end of the week, Ethan's accounts were frozen, his name linked to the scandal that had engulfed Lucas and the rival firm. Isabella filed for divorce and ensured the settlement terms were firmly in her favor. As the dust began to settle, Isabella stood in her penthouse, gazing out at the city she had once viewed as her kingdom. The betrayal had left scars, but it hadn't broken her. If anything, it had reminded her of who she was, a woman who didn't just survive, but thrived. Still, as she sipped her wine, a lingering thought crept into her mind. If the people closest to her could betray her so deeply, who else was waiting in the shadows? The game wasn't over. It had simply evolved. And Isabella was ready. Isabella's world was in disarray, but it was not chaos. It was a battlefield. And on this battlefield, she was the strategist, orchestrating her next moves with precision. The fallout from Lucas's removal and the exposure of her rival firm was rippling across the city's elite architecture circles. Ethan's betrayal had left a crater in her personal life. But Isabella was not one to wallow in self-pity. Instead, she resolved to wield her pain as a weapon. She was determined to not only restore her empire, but also dismantle the very foundations of those who had conspired against her. The first step was to ensure that her company was insulated from further damage. Isabella called an emergency meeting with her executive team, presenting a poised but firm demeanor. "Lucas's departure has created a leadership vacuum," she began, scanning the room. "But let me be clear, this is an opportunity, not a setback. We're implementing new protocols immediately to prevent any future misuse of company resources." Her team nodded in agreement, but Isabella noticed a flicker of unease in a few faces. She made a mental note of those reactions. Trust was now a currency she couldn't afford to spend lightly. The new protocols were far-reaching. Stricter oversight on expense reports, mandatory transparency for project budgets, and a complete restructuring of the firm's internal auditing system. It was a daunting undertaking, but Isabella was relentless. She spent long nights in her office personally reviewing files and emails. The betrayal had taught her that delegation was no longer a luxury she could afford. Every detail, every decision had to pass through her hands. Simultaneously, Isabella began her campaign against her competitor, the firm Ethan had secretly allied with. Using the evidence the private investigator had uncovered, she launched a quiet but devastating assault. A trusted contact in the city's zoning commission received an anonymous tip about irregularities in the firm's latest project. Within days, their permits were under review, halting construction on a high-profile development. At the same time, Isabella reached out to key investors and clients of the rival firm, subtly planting seeds of doubt about their integrity. She attended gala events and networking dinners, her charm as sharp as ever, ensuring that her competitor's name became synonymous with scandal. In a world where reputation was everything, Isabella knew how to weaponize whispers and turn them into shouts. The results were swift and satisfying. The rival firm's projects were delayed, their investors began pulling out, and their CEO was forced to make a public statement denying any wrongdoing. It was a statement that only fueled the fire as reporters dug deeper into the allegations. Isabella watched the fallout with a cold satisfaction. They had underestimated her, and now they were paying the price. But her personal life remained a tangle of loose ends, and Isabella knew she couldn't truly move forward without addressing Ethan. While her legal team handled the divorce proceedings, she began crafting her final confrontation with him. She wanted it to be decisive, a moment that left no doubt about where they stood. She arranged to meet Ethan at a neutral location, a private conference room in a boutique hotel downtown. When he arrived, he looked more disheveled than she had ever seen him. His usual confidence was replaced by a nervous energy, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape route. "Isabella," he began, his voice strained, "I know you're angry." He stopped. "Angry?" Isabella interrupted, her tone icy. "Ethan, angry doesn't begin to cover it. You betrayed me, you stole from me, and you sabotaged my company. So no, I'm not just angry. I'm disgusted." Ethan flinched but pressed on. "To what?" Isabella snapped, her voice rising. "To destroy everything I've built? To humiliate me? Or was it just about the money?" Ethan's face crumpled, and for a moment Isabella thought he might cry. I was scared," he admitted, "scared of being left behind. You were always so perfect, so untouchable. I felt like I was nothing compared to you." The admission caught Isabella off guard, but it didn't soften her resolve. "So instead of talking to me, you decided to destroy me. That's your justification?" Alicia nodded. "I did." Ethan's silence was answer enough. Ilya leaned back in her chair, her gaze piercing. "Here's how this is going to go. The divorce will proceed exactly as my lawyers have outlined. You'll sign the papers, relinquish all claims to my assets, and disappear from my life. If you try to fight it, I'll ensure that every detail of your involvement with Lucas and the rival firm becomes public knowledge. Do you understand?" Ethan nodded, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "I understand." Isabella stood, signaling the end of the conversation. "Good. Then we're done here." As she walked away, she felt a sense of finality. Ethan had been removed from her life, his power over her completely dismantled. But she couldn't shake the lingering bitterness of his betrayal. He had been her partner, her confidant, and he had turned on her without hesitation. That wound would take time to heal. With Ethan and Lucas out of the picture, Isabella turned her attention to Elena. She had given her former friend a choice: resign quietly or face public disgrace. Elena had chosen the former, sending a tearful email that attempted to explain her actions. Forgiveness was a luxury she couldn't afford, not when the betrayal had cut so deeply. Yet despite Elena's departure, Isabella couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that there was more to uncover. Her investigation into Lucas's activities had revealed connections to other employees, people she had trusted to uphold her vision. It seemed the rot had spread further than she'd imagined. Determined to root it out completely, Isabella expanded the internal audit, hiring a third-party firm to conduct a thorough review of her company's operations. The process was grueling, uncovering minor infractions and inefficiencies that Isabella hadn't even considered. But it also revealed something far more sinister, a secondary network of fraudulent accounts. This one tied to a mid-level manager who had been quietly siphoning funds for years. Isabella felt a wave of fury as she confronted the manager, a man named Victor who had been with the company for over a decade. His betrayal felt like a microcosm of everything she had endured, a reminder that even the most loyal-seeming people could harbor hidden agendas. Victor's termination was swift and public, a warning to anyone else who might consider crossing her. But it also served as a catalyst for Isabella's next move, a complete overhaul of her company's culture. She implemented new training programs, emphasizing integrity and accountability, and established an anonymous reporting system to ensure that any future misconduct would be caught early. As weeks turned into months, Isabella began to feel the weight of her efforts lifting. Her company was stronger than ever, her competitors were in shambles, and her personal life, though scarred, was finally free of toxic influences. But the journey had changed her. She was no longer the woman who believed in the inherent goodness of those around her. She had learned to trust herself above all else, to rely on her own instincts and judgment. One evening, as she stood on the penthouse balcony overlooking the city, Isabella allowed herself a rare moment of reflection. The betrayal she had endured had nearly destroyed her, but it had also forged her into someone stronger, someone more resilient. The world had tried to break her, but she had emerged victorious, her empire intact and her enemies vanquished. Yet as she sipped her wine, a shadow of doubt lingered. The people who had betrayed her had been those she trusted most, her husband, her best friend, her partner. If they could deceive her, who else might be waiting in the wings? The thought was sobering, but Isabella pushed it aside. She couldn't live in fear of shadows. She would face whatever came next with the same determination that had carried her through this storm. After all, she was Isabella Grant, unshakable, unstoppable, and always ready for the next battle. The next months had passed since the storm of betrayal had shattered Isabella's world. On the surface, everything appeared stable. Her company was thriving, her personal life was under control, and the conspirators who had sought to undermine her were now powerless. But in the quiet moments, when the city's lights flickered against her penthouse windows, Isabella couldn't shake the feeling that the battle wasn't entirely over. The scars left by betrayal were not the kind that faded easily. They were etched deep, whispering doubts into her mind when she least expected them. Trust had become a fragile commodity, one she wasn't ready to extend to anyone, not even herself at times. Yet Isabella was determined to move forward. She had learned to live with her wounds, but she would not let them define her. Her resolve was tested one evening during a board meeting, when one of her senior advisors, Richard, raised concerns about a new project. The Rivera Residences, he said, referring to the ambitious development Isabella had greenlit to replace Lucas's botched flagship. It's bold, but some of the investors are worried. They think we might be stretching ourselves too thin after the audit. Isabella leaned forward, her sharp gaze locking on Richard. "Let me be clear," she said, her voice steady but firm. "The Rivera Residences isn't just a project. It's a statement. It tells the world that we've emerged, stronger, more focused, and more ambitious than ever. If our investors can't see that, I'll speak to them directly." Richard nodded, But Isabella could see hesitation in his eyes. She made a mental note to keep an eye on him. Hesitation was a seed, and if left unchecked, it could grow into something far more dangerous. Later that night, Isabella found herself reviewing the final designs for the Rivera residences. The sleek, modern lines of the blueprints filled her with a sense of pride. This was her vision, untainted, uncorrupted. But as she traced her finger along the detailed plans, her phone buzzed with a notification. It was another anonymous message, similar to the one that had first revealed Ethan and Lucas's duplicity. This time it was a single line of text. "You missed one." Attached was a grainy photo of Victor, the mid-level manager she had fired during the audit. He was sitting in a cafe with a man Isabella didn't recognize, their heads bent close in conversation. Isabella's stomach tightened. She had believed Victor's betrayal had been the end of the internal rot in her company. This photo suggested otherwise. Was someone still working against her, or was this just an attempt to rattle her, to exploit her lingering paranoia? She forwarded the message to the private investigator she had worked with before, instructing him to dig deeper. If there was still a threat within her company, she needed to know. As the investigation unfolded, Isabella focused on the Rivera residences with renewed intensity. She threw herself into every detail, from the marketing campaign to the construction timelines. The project became her refuge, a tangible reminder of her ability to create something beautiful despite the chaos she had endured. But the cracks in her sense of security continued to widen. The investigator's report arrived a week later, and its contents were unsettling. Victor had indeed been meeting with an outsider, a former employee of her rival firm, the one Ethan had colluded with. The man was now working as a consultant for a smaller architecture firm, one that had recently gained traction by underbidding Isabella's company on several mid-tier projects. The connections were tenuous but troubling. Was Victor feeding information to this new competitor? Was there a broader conspiracy at play? Isabella's mind raced with possibilities. The idea that someone was still working against her, even after everything she had endured, reignited her fury. Rather than confronting Victor directly, Isabella decided to play a longer game. She quietly had the smaller firm investigated, tracing its sudden rise and its suspiciously low bids. What she uncovered was shocking. The firm's owner was a former associate of Lucas, someone she had overlooked during her initial purge. It seemed that Lucas's web of deceit had been more extensive than she'd realized. Armed with this knowledge, Isabella devised her response. She reached out to a few trusted allies in the industry, sharing her findings under the guise of a casual conversation. The whispers began to spread, and soon the smaller firm's reputation was under scrutiny. Investors began pulling out, wary of being associated with a company that had ties to such a public scandal. At the same time, Isabella ensured that Victor's role was quietly exposed. She arranged for an internal memo to be leaked, outlining the reasons for his dismissal and the evidence of his misconduct. The memo painted Victor as a rogue element, distancing the company from his actions while reinforcing Isabella's commitment to transparency. With her enemies neutralized, Isabella allowed herself a rare moment of reflection. She stood on the balcony of the Rivera residence's nearly completed tower, the city spread out before her like a living blueprint. The building was a testament to her resilience, a physical embodiment of her determination to rise above betrayal and rebuild stronger. Gripping the balcony tighter, she activated the dojo. But as she gazed at the skyline, a thought lingered in the back of her mind. No matter how carefully she planned, no matter how meticulously she controlled her empire, there would always be shadows, people with hidden agendas, waiting for their moment to strike. It was a reality she couldn't escape. For a brief moment, Isabella allowed herself to feel the weight of everything she had endured. The betrayal of Ethan, Lucas, and Elena, the fractures in her trust, the sleepless nights spent piecing her life back together. But then she straightened, her resolve hardening once more. She had survived the storm. She had rebuilt her empire, and if another storm came, she would face it with the same strength and cunning that had carried her through the first. As the wind swept through the unfinished balcony, Isabella turned back toward the interior of the building. There was still work to be done, still battles to fight. But she was ready. The shadows might linger, but they would never define her.